So, of course, the big news here lately has been this school shooting in Florida and the gun control debate that has erupted as a result. And it's not really a debate. It's a one-sided leftist harangue. It's a set of prepackaged narratives and prepackaged propaganda and spin that has been rolled out and deployed by the entire, media, academia, activist establishment in the wake of this tragedy, as it always is, and primarily at no other time. So why do we focus on this one issue of school shootings so inordinately? And at the risk of sounding callous, I'm going to say that this issue is a very small, almost statistically insignificant aspect of the entire question. It is a very small number of deaths per year in relation to the total number of, even homicide deaths for school-aged children. Now, the situation there has only improved over the last 25 years. The number of annual homicide deaths for school-aged children has gone down since the early to mid-90s from something like 3,500 per year to 1,500 per year in total. All causes, all locations for school-aged children 5 to 18 over the last 25 years. And, that's a great thing. That's great news. That should be something to celebrate. But it's not celebrated. We focus on this very small number of very sensational, very dramatic kind of media circus events that typically result in low double-digit number of fatalities per year. Something like 30, 40 on average per year. And, why do we focus on those and not look at the big picture, which is getting better and better? And, why do we weight those particular incidents, those few incidents of, gratuitous violence and those few deaths from these incidents, which are almost, statistical noise, almost a statistical rounding error? Why do we look at those so much more intently than everything else? And why do we focus on those? Why do we weight those particular deaths more heavily than others? And it seems like, the only reason we do that, or the main reason that it's done, is because that's the only way to sustain this level of moral outrage and hysteria and shrillness and polarizing rhetoric. Because over the last 25 years, the numbers, the fundamentals have improved dramatically. Violence against school-aged children has gone down by more than half. That's great. So how are you going to sustain that outrage unless you focus on this one little thing that, hasn't changed much over the last 25 years and yet is still very dramatic and very visible, especially in media coverage. And so why are they doing it? Why are they framing the issue in this way in terms of this particular part of the issue? And, it seems like it's pretty obvious they're up to something shady because they are engaging in this framing and loading. And the framing part is looking at that little thing to the exclusion of all others, and the loading is the tremendous amount of moral outrage that it's loaded with and imbued with, and the hysteria and the calls for sweeping reforms that arise from this tiny fraction of incidents and deaths. And framing and loading is a technique of postmodern deception. You're never going to reach a correct conclusion if you're doing that. It's fallacious on a number of levels. It's cherry picking. And they trot out this rhetoric, they trot out this propaganda, they trot out the spin after every dramatic incident as a way of trying to override reason with emotion, because that's the only case in which these narratives and these demands and proposals seem the slightest bit credible. And you can't reach a correct conclusion by doing that. Now, they must have some purpose in it, and you can reach a conclusion that you want to reach by employing those techniques of deception and propaganda. And it seems like the most obvious explanation for what they want is they want to disarm their political rivals. They want to disarm Team Red, Red Tribe, America's traditional rural conservative population. And, the most obvious reason for wanting to do that is to increase the cost of resistance and revolt, and therefore to decrease the cost of imposing hostile and unpopular and parasitic agendas, so that they can impose more and extract more at less cost to themselves and less risk to themselves. That seems to be the most likely motive and the most likely explanation. And what do they demand? They demand, some of them that we hand over our guns, and most of them that we stop acquiring new ones, for legitimate sporting purposes, for self-defense, or as a last resort, for resistance against tyrannical and overreaching government, and as a guarantee of our popular sovereignty against a potentially hostile government. So we're supposed to hand over the guns to this government that failed on multiple levels to protect these students at this school. There were multiple warnings about this particular individual, and I'm not really going to get into the conspiracy stuff for the most part because it's not necessary, and if you're wrong about any of it, you look like an idiot, and you look like an asshole. But there are some fairly credible allegations that this lack of response to these warnings about this particular individual were part of a larger pattern where, police were not addressing crimes committed by students. They were not responding to complaints made about students as a way of, decreasing their juvenile delinquency numbers in order for the governments in these jurisdictions to get more federal funding for education. And so you have basically a pattern of negligence that was leaving an escalating problem with juvenile delinquency and criminality unaddressed by local authorities. And on top of that, you have the failure of the FBI to follow up on leads. And on top of that, you have the school resource officer, as well as possibly several other deputies who responded almost immediately to the outbreak of violence, but simply took up defensive positions and did nothing about it. So you have multiple levels of government failure here by the people who, according to these arguments, are supposed to be the only ones to have guns, and who we're supposed to entrust, solely with the responsibility of protecting and defending us. Well, this is a really terrible argument and a terrible proposal to make in response to this. And I've got some potentially more constructive suggestions. How about we address the war against boys? How about we address the attempt to emasculate and effeminize boys, to attack them for being boys, to drug them, to make them less like boys? How about we address the issue of persistent shaming and abuse directed against boys? How about we address the issue of, the war on families? And these people coming from unstable homes, and the mental health issues in the mental health system, and the overuse of psychiatric drugs, which all of these guys are on some kind of psychiatric drugs for the most part. A lot of them come from broken homes. How about we address the war on religion and the war on communities, where people's spiritual health is sacrificed to create this alienating, nihilistic, materialistic consumer culture of interchangeable cogs, who have no meaning and no identity and no purpose beyond just to participate in mass consumerism. That can't be healthy for people. So there are a lot of issues here that need to be addressed. And the proposals that are being made are, it looks like, dishonest, duplicitous, motivated. They've got dark and ulterior motives behind them. And they're inadequate, frankly. And they're being made by the same people who are causing the problem in the first place. And their intent is to empower the same people who are failing to protect us already. So, there's a lot of issues here to address. And, the way it's being addressed is dishonest, it's shady, it's manipulative, and, just generally inadequate. And, furthermore, one thing you hear a lot when you say that you value the Second Amendment as a guarantor of popular sovereignty, the response you always get is, oh, well, what's your rifle going to do against a tank? What's your rifle going to do against a fighter plane? What's your rifle going to do against a drone strike? And this is really pathetically bad, coming from people who have seen the total failure of a modern advanced military to subdue Afghanistan, to subdue Iraq, to subdue Vietnam. All right? And even more so because we don't want to fight the U.S. military. We don't want to fight the U.S. police, the American police. The American people don't want to fight the military and the police. And we don't need to. There are a lot of ways for an armed populace to win an armed revolt against a hostile government without engaging their military and police forces in pitched battle. And I'm not necessarily advocating it. I'm not recommending it. But just from a theoretical point of view, the best way to obtain what you demand is just to be enough of a bloody, costly nuisance that it's cheaper to give you what you want than not. And that's something an armed populace can definitely do. And, furthermore, if you're positively disposed to the idea of a military dictatorship or an authoritarian government, as I am, because, for example, the military is basically a red state institution. It's not something that's alien to our people. It's drawn from it. And, fundamentally has red state values and sensibilities. But also because the systemic issues and incentive issues, make a military dictatorship or authoritarian government likely to be more friendly to rule of law, more friendly to individual liberty than a democratic one. So, in that case, you have another path to victory. If you just cause enough trouble that the military feels they have to step in and take charge, that's a victory condition. If you cause enough trouble that it becomes obvious the civilian government isn't able to maintain control and maintain order, and the military feels like they have to step in and take over, that's a victory condition, okay? So this idea that it would be very difficult for an armed populace to win a conventional war against a conventional military, and therefore, you shouldn't have the right to keep and bear arms, that it's irrelevant, it's absolutely not true. The ability or inability of an armed populace to defeat a conventional military is just simply not relevant. It may be possible, it may be impossible, but it's just not relevant. So, how dangerous is America overall? Well, if you're white or Asian, it's actually less dangerous than the European average. It's actually less dangerous than the Asian average in America. So you have a high amount of violence by world standards, medium high, not the highest, not the lowest. But, it primarily occurs over pretty mundane altercations, pretty mundane, criminal activities. And it occurs within racial and ethnic groups more so than between them, just because of proximity and opportunity and the fact that people tend to self-segregate. So if you're white or Asian, America is safer than the European average. It's obviously less safe than Western Europe, but it's more safe than Eastern Europe for the most part. So, it's not clear to me that we're in a crisis, except for a crisis of the making of these people who are pushing all of this propaganda and dishonest and polarizing rhetoric. And these considerations of sovereignty and stuff are going to be obvious to all people. Not all people are sovereign. Women in particular are not sovereign. But, men understand these issues a lot better and value these issues a lot more highly. And ultimately, it's probably going to come down to conflict.